She was 38 years old, with a face half destroyed by fire, standing among fresh-faced women at a frontier trading post where men came to find wives like they'd come to buy horses, judging teeth and temperament with the same critical eye. But when Dorothea Mercer felt a small brown hand slip into hers, she discovered that sometimes the family you're meant to have chooses you first, in ways that terrify everyone watching. The autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and desperation through Fort Ridgway's dusty main square, where 11 women stood in an uneven line outside Brennan's trading post, waiting to be chosen. Dorothea Mercer stood at the far end of that line, her worn carpet bag clutched in hands that had long ago stopped trembling with hope. Her bonnet pulled low over the left side of her face, where the scars began. She was the oldest woman there by more than a decade. The others were girls, really, most of them no older than 25, with smooth skin and bright eyes and the kind of hopeful nervousness that came from believing the world still held good things in store. They'd come west on the promise of new lives, answering advertisements placed by lonely ranchers and prospectors and storekeepers who needed wives to help tame this brutal country. Dorothea had come west for different reasons. She'd come because there was nothing left for her back in Ohio, because after the fire that killed her husband and took half her face, the charitable smiles had slowly transformed into uncomfortable glances and then into no glances at all. Because even her own sister had stopped inviting her to Sunday dinners, claiming the children were frightened by her appearance. Because at 38, scarred and widowed, she'd become invisible in polite society, useful only for the kind of work no one else wanted to do. The wagon train master had been reluctant to take her payment at first. "Ma'am, I should tell you straight that Fort Ridgway ain't exactly welcoming to women traveling alone. And with your situation, well, you might find the frontier even less forgiving than wherever you're running from." But Dorothea had pressed her money into his calloused palm and said simply, "I've already survived the worst thing that could happen to me. Whatever's out west can't be worse than staying here." She'd been wrong about that. Fort Ridgway was a collection of rough timber buildings clustered around a mud-churned square, surrounded by endless prairie that stretched to a horizon so distant it made her dizzy. The fort itself had been abandoned by the army 2 years prior, but settlers had claimed the buildings and the name, creating a rough trading post where trappers, cattlemen, and desperate homesteaders came to buy supplies and sometimes wives. The arrangement was simple and brutal in its efficiency. Women who'd paid passage west, with the understanding they'd find husbands upon arrival, would stand in the square while available men looked them over. The men would ask questions, assess capabilities, and make their selections. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly civilized. But it was honest in a way that Eastern courtship had never been. Dorothea watched as the first man stepped forward from the loose gathering near the trading post. He was young, maybe 30, with the lean build of someone who worked hard and ate little. His eyes moved down the line of women with the practiced assessment of a horse trader, lingering on the youngest and prettiest before moving on. "Name's Jack Holloway," he announced to no one in particular. "I got a homestead claim 15 miles north. Looking for a wife who can handle hard work, knows her way around a kitchen, and won't complain about the isolation." He paused, then added with brutal honesty, "And I'd prefer someone easy on the eyes, since we'll be looking at each other for the rest of our lives." A pretty blonde girl near the front of the line stepped forward, her cheeks flushed, but her voice steady. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Mr. Holloway. I can cook and sew, and I've helped run my father's farm since I was 12. And I promise I won't complain, no matter how hard things get." She managed a shy smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely lovely. Jack Holloway's expression softened immediately. "Well then, Miss Mitchell, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming Mrs. Holloway." Just like that, the first match was made. Sarah collected her bags and followed Jack to a wagon, while the other women watched with a mixture of envy and relief that the process had begun. 3 more men stepped forward in succession, A grizzled prospector in his 50s chose a sturdy German woman who looked like she could chop wood and birth babies without breaking stride. A young store clerk with soft hands and nervous eyes selected a delicate girl from Boston who looked equally terrified of the frontier. A cattle rancher with more confidence than charm pointed at a red-haired woman and said, "You'll do," as if selecting a head of livestock. With each selection, the line of women grew shorter and the remaining men grew more restless. Dorothea felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over her like a shroud. She'd known this would happen, had prepared herself for it, but knowing and experiencing were different things. And each time a man's eyes slid past her without even a moment of consideration. She felt the old shame rise in her throat like bile. A tall man in his 40s approached the line, his face weathered by sun and wind, his clothes clean but worn. He had the look of someone who'd been handsome once, before life had carved lines of sorrow into his features. His dark hair was shot through with silver, and his grey eyes held a weariness that Dorothea recognized in her own mirror. "I'm Coleman Frost," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I've got a ranch west of here, decent house, good water. Lost my wife 3 years back to fever. I've got 2 children who need a mother's hand, and I've got the means to provide for a family. I'm looking for a woman of good character who understands that frontier life is hard, and that love might come later, if it comes at all." It was the most honest proposal Dorothea had heard all morning. No promises of romance or easy living. Just the stark reality of survival and the possibility of something more if they were lucky. She found herself hoping just for a moment that this man might be different, that he might look past her scars and see the capable woman underneath. But Coleman Frost's eyes moved down the line of remaining women with the same careful assessment as all the others. They touched briefly on Dorothea, registered the bonnet pulled low over her scarred face, and moved on without pause. He settled on a woman named Catherine, perhaps 30 years old, with a pleasant face and the practical bearing of someone who knew how to work. Dorothea felt the familiar sting of rejection, but also something else. Disappointment, yes, but also a strange sense of relief. She'd convinced herself she wanted to be chosen, but the truth was more complicated. Did she really want to tie herself to another man who saw her as a solution to a problem rather than a person worth knowing? The selection process continued as the morning sun climbed higher and the remaining pool of women dwindled. By noon, only 3 women remained standing in that dusty square, and Dorothea was one of them. The other 2 were older widows like herself, though neither bore visible scars. They stood with the resigned patience of people who'd learned not to expect much from life. The remaining men shuffled and muttered among themselves. These were the desperate ones, the ones with nothing to offer but hard work and harder lives. A one-armed trapper who smelled of whiskey and beaver pelts. A farmer whose land had been partially claimed by locusts. A prospector who'd been searching for gold for 15 years without finding so much as a promising glimmer. Dorothea watched them assess their limited options with the same enthusiasm they might show for spoiled meat. She was just turning toward the trading post to inquire about return passage, or perhaps work as a washerwoman, when she felt it, a small hand slipping into hers. Warm fingers threading through her own with the unconscious trust of childhood. Dorothea looked down in surprise to find a little girl standing beside her. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with long black hair woven into 2 neat braids and skin the color of honey-soaked oak. Her eyes were dark and serious, studying Dorothea's face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been mended many times, and her feet were tucked into worn moccasins decorated with delicate beadwork. The child was clearly of mixed heritage, native and white, with features that belonged to both worlds and fully to neither, in a place like Fort Ridgeway that made her something to be pitied at best and scorned at worst. "Hello," Dorothea said softly, surprised by the comfort of that small hand in hers. "Are you lost, sweetheart?" The girl shook her head solemnly. "No, ma'am. I'm right where I'm supposed to be." Her English was perfect, with just a slight rhythm to it that suggested another language lived in her thoughts. "My name is Neeby, but white folks call me Birdie. Papa says I should use Birdie so people don't look at us funny, but I like Neeby better. It means water in my mother's language." "Neeby is a beautiful name," Dorothea said, acutely aware that the entire square had gone quiet, that everyone was watching this unexpected interaction. "Where is your papa?" "Right there." Neeby pointed toward Coleman Frost, the rancher who'd chosen Catherine just an hour earlier. "He picked the wrong lady. I told him this morning I needed a mama who understood about being different, about people looking at you like you're broken. He didn't listen. But then I saw you standing here and I knew. You're the one who's supposed to come home with us." The silence that followed was absolute. Dorothea felt every eye in that square boring into her, felt the weight of judgment and shock, and something that might have been horror. She looked up to find Coleman Frost frozen in mid-conversation with Catherine, his face cycling rapidly through confusion, embarrassment, and something else she couldn't identify. "Birdie." His voice carried across the square with the firm patience of a parent who'd had this conversation before. "What did we talk about this morning?" "You said we were coming to meet my new mama," Neeby said with devastating childhood logic. "Well, here she is. She's got kind eyes and strong hands, and I can tell she knows how to make real food, not the burned mush you try to feed me. And she's got marks on her face like I've got marks in my heart. That means she understands." Dorothea's breath caught at the simple poetry of the child's words. She felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept carefully locked away since the fire. This child saw her, really saw her. Not the scars, not the age, not the awkward, unmarriageable woman everyone else saw. This little girl looked at her damaged face and recognized a kindred spirit. "Sweetheart," Dorothea managed, her voice thick with emotion she didn't quite understand. "I'm very flattered, but your father has already chosen someone else. The lady he was speaking with, she'll make you a fine mother." Neeby's grip on her hand tightened. "No, she looked at me the way people look at stray dogs. Like maybe she'll feed me if she has to, but she'd rather I just went away. You didn't look at me like that. You looked at me like I'm worth knowing." Coleman Frost was moving toward them now, his long strides eating up the distance between them, his weathered face tight with mortification. Catherine stood where he'd left her, her expression hovering between relief and indignation. The crowd of onlookers leaned forward like spectators at a horse race, eager to see how this drama would unfold. "Miss, I apologize for my daughter's behavior," Coleman said when he reached them, his voice rough with embarrassment. "Birdie has a way of getting ideas in her head, and once they're there, well, they're harder to dislodge than a tick in summer. She doesn't understand how these arrangements work." But Dorothea wasn't looking at Coleman. She was looking at Neeby, at this fierce little girl who'd walked up to a stranger and claimed her as family. She was thinking about the way the child had described her scars, not as damage, but as evidence of understanding. She was remembering what it felt like to be seen as broken, to be looked at the way people look at stray dogs. "Mr. Frost," Dorothea heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Perhaps your daughter understands more than you think she does." Coleman's grey eyes snapped to her face, really looking at her for the first time. She saw him register the scars that twisted the left side of her face from forehead to jaw, the puckered skin that had once been smooth, the eye that didn't quite close all the way anymore. She waited for the usual reaction, the quick glance away, the carefully neutral expression that was somehow worse than outright revulsion. But Coleman Frost just looked at her, really looked, and in his eyes she saw something unexpected. Recognition, not of her face but of her circumstances. The understanding of one outcast recognizing another. "Miss," he said carefully, "what's your name?" "Dorothea Mercer, Mrs. Mercer technically, though I've been a widow for 3 years." "Mrs. Mercer," he glanced down at his daughter, whose hand was still firmly clasped in Dorothea's, then back up at her face. "I already made an arrangement with Miss Catherine. I release you from that arrangement." Catherine called out from across the square, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I have no desire to enter into a marriage where the child has already decided I'm unsuitable. Better to find that out now than after vows are spoken." Coleman closed his eyes briefly, and Dorothea saw the exhaustion there, the weariness of a man who'd been fighting battles on too many fronts for too long. When he opened them again, he looked at her with something that might have been desperation. "Mrs. Mercer, I need to be straight with you. I'm not looking for romance. I'm not even sure I'm capable of it anymore after losing my wife. What I need is help. Help running a ranch, help raising 2 children, help surviving in country that doesn't much care whether we make it or not. If you came west looking for love and pretty words and easy affection, you should walk away right now." Dorothea felt Nibi's hand squeeze hers, felt the hope radiating from that small body. She thought about the return passage east, about going back to a place where she'd already been rejected. She thought about the way this child had chosen her, had looked past every reason to dismiss her and decided she was worth keeping. "Mr. Frost," she said quietly, "I'm 38 years old, with a face that frightens children and a past that includes more failure than success. I came west because there was nothing left for me back east, and I stayed in this square even after it was clear no one wanted me because I'm too stubborn to know when to quit. I'm not looking for romance either. I'm looking for a place where I can be useful, where I can matter to someone. If you're offering that, then perhaps we can help each other." Something shifted in Coleman's expression. The careful guardedness cracked just slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the armor. "I have another child at home. A boy, 4 years old. He doesn't talk much, hasn't since his mother died. The ranch is 20 miles west of here, isolated enough that you won't see neighbors for weeks at a time. The house needs work, the land needs work, everything needs work. And I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Mercer, I don't know if I'm doing right by Birdie, bringing her up out here. She needs a mother who can teach her the things I can't, who can help her understand how to be both the thing she is, instead of feeling like she has to choose one or the other. Matur." Dorothea looked down at Nibi, at the fierce hope burning in those dark eyes. This child had chosen her, had seen something in her scarred face that spoke to her own wounds. How could she walk away from that? "I can start immediately," Dorothea said. The wagon ride to the Frost Ranch took 4 hours through country so vast and empty, it made Dorothea's chest tighten with something between awe and terror. Coleman drove the team with the easy confidence of a man who'd traveled this route 1,000 times, his weathered hands steady on the reins. Nibi sat pressed against Dorothea's side, chattering about everything and nothing. Her small voice the only sound besides creaking wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. Catherine had departed with the one-armed trapper after all, both of them looking vaguely relieved to have found someone willing to settle. The remaining women had scattered to various arrangements, and Fort Ridgway had returned to its usual business of survival and commerce. Dorothea had signed no papers, made no official vows, but she'd climbed into Coleman Frost's wagon with her carpet bag and her damaged face. "And that seemed to be contract enough for the frontier. That's Copper Ridge," Nibi said, pointing to a line of rust-colored hills rising in the distance. "In summer the whole ridge turns gold with wildflowers. Mama used to take me up there to pick sage and sweetgrass. She said the spirits of her people still walked those hills, that if I listened carefully, I could hear them singing." The child's voice held no sadness, just matter-of-fact memory, as if speaking of the dead was as natural as speaking of the weather. Dorothea glanced at Coleman, saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Dorothea said carefully. "She was Ojibwe," Nibi continued with the same casual directness. "That's what white folks call Chippewa, but Mama said we should use the real name when we're family. She met Papa when he was trapping up north before he decided to try ranching instead. Her people didn't much like her marrying a white man, and his people didn't much like him marrying her. So they came out here where nobody knew them and started over." She paused, then added with devastating clarity, "But starting over doesn't mean people stop judging you." It just means the judging comes from strangers instead of family. Birdie, Coleman said quietly, his voice holding a warning. It's true, Papa. You know it's true. The rancher at Three Forks wouldn't sell you supplies last month because of what I am. And Mrs. Henshaw at the fort won't let her children play with me. She says I'm savage. Nibby delivered this information without apparent emotion, but Dorothea felt the child's body tense against her side. Dorothea's throat tightened with fury on behalf of this fierce little girl who'd already learned that the world would judge her for circumstances beyond her control. Mrs. Henshaw is a fool, she said firmly. And foolish people often say cruel things because it makes them feel important. You're not savage, Nibby. You're remarkable. The child looked up at her with those serious dark eyes. You really think so? You're not just saying it because Papa's listening. I really think so. And I don't say things I don't mean. Life's too short for pretty lies. Something like a smile tugged at Coleman's mouth, though he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. You'll fit right in then, Mrs. Mercer. We're not much for pretty lies at the Frost Ranch. The ranch appeared gradually, rising from the prairie, like something that had grown there rather than been built. The house was larger than Dorothea had expected, a solid two-story structure of weathered timber with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. The barn and outbuildings showed signs of careful maintenance, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against golden grass. It wasn't prosperous exactly, but it wasn't desperate either. This was the home of a man who worked hard and kept his promises to the land. As the wagon rolled into the yard, a small figure emerged from the barn. The boy was tiny, no more than 4 years old, with his father's dark hair and build, but his mother's copper-toned skin. He stood absolutely still, watching their approach with the wary intensity of a wild animal, deciding whether to flee or fight. That's Thomas, Nibby whispered. He hasn't said a word since Mama died. Papa thinks he's forgotten how to talk, but I know better. He remembers. He just doesn't see the point anymore. Coleman brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake with practiced efficiency. He climbed down and moved toward the boy with careful slowness, as if approaching a spooked horse. Tommy, we've got a visitor. This is Mrs. Mercer. She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping around the place. Thomas's dark eyes moved from his father to Dorothea, studying her with unnerving focus. She saw him register the scars on her face, saw something flicker in his expression that might have been recognition, or curiosity, or fear. Then he turned and ran back into the barn without a sound. He does that, Nibby said as Coleman helped her down from the wagon. Runs away when things feel like too much. Papa says to give him time, that grief has its own schedule. Coleman reached up to help Dorothea down, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist. The moment her feet touched solid ground, he released her and stepped back, maintaining careful distance. I should show you the house. Help you get settled. Birdie can show you where everything is, while I tend to the horses. But Dorothea was watching the barn, where Thomas had disappeared. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the structure. Coleman hesitated, clearly torn between hospitality and protecting his son from potential upset. He might not come out. And if he does, well, he won't talk to you. Hasn't talked to anyone in over a year. That's all right. Sometimes the best conversations happen without words. She walked to the barn before Coleman could object, aware that she was overstepping boundaries that hadn't even been properly established yet. The interior was dim and sweet-smelling, full of hay and leather and the warm animal scent of horses. She found Thomas in the far corner, sitting in an empty stall, with his knees drawn up to his chest, making himself as small as possible. Dorothea didn't approach him. Instead, she settled herself on a hay bale about 10 feet away, arranging her skirts and looking around the barn with genuine interest. This is a good barn, she said conversationally, as if speaking to the air itself. Well built. Someone who knows what they're doing put this together. I grew up on a farm in Ohio, though nothing as grand as this. Our barn was barely big enough for 2 cows and a mule, and it leaked something terrible every spring. Thomas didn't respond, but she saw his head tilt slightly, listening. I'm scared of horses, Dorothea continued, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. Have been since I was about your age. A stallion kicked me in the shoulder and broke something. I can still remember the sound it made, like a stick snapping. After that, I couldn't make myself get close to horses for years. Still makes me nervous, truth be told, but I've learned to hide it better. She paused, examining her hands. The scars from the fire extended down her left arm, visible where her sleeve had ridden up. I'm scared of fire too. That one's more recent. 3 years ago, there was an accident. Our house caught fire in the night. My husband got me out, then went back for our strongbox, the one with all our important papers and what little money we had. The roof came down on him. Her voice remained steady, clinical almost, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. I tried to go back in after him. That's where these came from. She gestured to her scarred face and arm. People look at me different now. Some of them look away because the scars make them uncomfortable. Some of them stare because they're curious. Most of them just see the damage and decide I'm not worth knowing anymore. That's why I came west. Figured if I was going to be judged anyway, might as well be judged in new country. Thomas had shifted position, no longer curled quite so tightly into himself. His dark eyes were fixed on her face, taking in the scars with the frank curiosity of childhood. Your sister tells me you stopped talking after your mama died, Dorothea said. I think that's probably a smart choice. Words don't help much when something hurts that bad. And people always want you to talk about it, to explain how you feel, as if putting pain into words somehow makes it smaller. But it doesn't, does it? Sometimes the pain is too big for words. Sometimes silence is the only honest response. She stood slowly, brushing hay from her skirts. I'm going to be staying here for a while, helping your papa with things around the ranch. I won't make you talk if you don't want to. But if you ever decide you want to, I'm a pretty good listener. And if you never want to, well, that's fine too. Sometimes the best friendship is just being quiet together. Dorothea walked toward the barn door, then paused and turned back. One more thing, Thomas. I'm sorry about your mama. I'm sorry you had to lose her so young. And I'm not going to tell you it gets easier, because that would be a pretty lie. And I don't traffic in those. But I will tell you this, the people we love don't really leave us. They're in here, she touched her chest. In every good thing they taught us, in every moment we remember them. Your mama's still with you, son. She's in your sister's smile and your father's strength, and in whatever it is that makes you who you are. Death can take a lot of things, but it can't take that. She left the barn and found Coleman standing by the wagon, ostensibly checking the harness, but clearly having positioned himself where he could watch the barn door. When he saw her emerge alone, disappointment flickered across his features. He didn't talk, Coleman said. It wasn't a question, no, but he listened. That's a start. Nebe came running from the house, her earlier reserve completely abandoned. Mrs. Mercer, come see. The kitchen has a real cook stove, not just a hearth. And there's a root cellar that stays cool even in summer. And upstairs, there's a room that used to be Mama's sewing room, but Papa hasn't been able to go in there since she died. So maybe you could use it. The house was better than Dorothea had dared hope. Someone, probably Coleman's late wife, had built this home with care and intention. The main room held a sturdy table, comfortable chairs, shelves lined with books and windows that let in generous light. The kitchen was well organized, if somewhat dusty from disuse. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms opened off a narrow hallway. Nebe led her to the smallest room at the back of the house. It held a narrow bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. The walls were bare, except for a few hooks for hanging clothes, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that spoke of long neglect. This was Mama's room before she married Papa, Nebe explained. Then it was for sewing and quilting and things. Papa moved all her fabric and thread to the attic after she died. Said he couldn't stand looking at her unfinished projects. The child's voice was carefully neutral, but Dorothea heard the hurt underneath. I think he was afraid that if he kept her things where he could see them, he'd never stop missing her. Your father loved her very much, Dorothea said gently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I know. That's why I worry about him. He works so hard all the time, from before sunrise until after dark. He never laughs anymore, never sings like he used to. It's like part of him died with Mama, and the rest is just going through the motions. Nibi sat on the bed, her small legs dangling. That's why I picked you at the fort. Papa needs someone who understands about surviving. Someone who's strong enough to still be standing after the worst has happened. The weight of expectation in those words made Dorothea's chest tight. This child expected her to somehow heal a grieving family, to step into a dead woman's shoes and make everything right again. It was an impossible task, and they both knew it. Nibi, I need you to understand something. Dorothea sat beside the girl, choosing her words carefully. I can't replace your mother. I won't even try. What your mama and your papa had, that's theirs, sacred and separate. I'm not here to take her place or make everyone forget her. I'm here to help in whatever way I can, but I can't fix grief. Nobody can. Grief has to run its course. I'm not asking you to replace her, Nibi said with startling maturity. I'm asking you to help us remember how to live. There's a difference. Over the next week, Dorothea learned the rhythms of the Frost Ranch. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, learning to cook on the temperamental wood stove that required constant adjustment. She discovered that Coleman took his coffee black and strong, that Nibi would eat anything if you didn't make a fuss about it, and that Thomas would only eat if you set his plate down and walked away. Giving him privacy with his food, the work was endless. Washing clothes in the big copper tub behind the house, scrubbing them against a washboard until her hands were raw. Tending the vegetable garden that had gone mostly to seed during Coleman's period of solitary survival. Mending clothes by lamplight after the children were in bed. Sweeping floors that seemed to generate new dust the moment her back was turned. But there were small victories too. The first time Thomas ate a full meal without running away. The afternoon Nibi laughed at something Dorothea said, a genuine belly laugh that rang through the house like music. The evening Coleman came in from the fields and paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of a clean house and a hot meal waiting, and something like relief crossed his weary features. They maintained careful distance from each other, Coleman and Dorothea. He slept in the barn most nights, claiming he needed to keep watch over a pregnant mare. She stayed in her small room, the door firmly closed. During the day they worked in parallel, rarely speaking beyond practical necessities. It was a business arrangement, nothing more, and they both seemed determined to keep it that way, but Dorothea couldn't help noticing things. The way Coleman's hands were always busy, constantly mending or building or fixing something, as if stopping meant having to feel. The way he looked at his children when they weren't watching, his face naked with love and fear. The way he still wore his wedding ring, even though his wife had been dead for 3 years. On the 8th day, disaster struck. Dorothea was hanging laundry when she heard Nibi scream. The sound cut through the afternoon quiet like a knife, full of genuine terror. She dropped the wet sheet she'd been holding and ran toward the barn, her heart hammering. She found Nibi standing frozen in the doorway, her face pale with shock. Thomas, the girl managed. Thomas went into the far pasture by himself. Papa said never to go there alone because of the ravine, but he did. And now Papa's gone after him, and I heard shouting, and I think something's wrong. Dorothea didn't hesitate. She grabbed Nibi's hand and ran toward the far pasture, her long skirts tangling around her legs, her lungs burning. In the distance, she could see Coleman at the edge of a steep ravine, lying flat on his stomach, his arms extended down over the edge. As they got closer, Dorothea could hear Thomas crying. Not the silent tears she'd seen him shed a few times, but actual vocal crying, the terrified wails of a small child in mortal danger. She reached the ravine edge and looked down to see Thomas clinging to a narrow ledge about 8 feet below the rim, his small fingers white-knuckled on the crumbling rock. Coleman had managed to grab one of the boy's arms, but the angle was wrong. He couldn't get enough leverage to pull Thomas up, and the boy was too scared to help himself. "I can't hold him much longer," Coleman ground out, his voice tight with strain. "The rock's giving way. I need rope from the barn, but if I let go to get it, Nibi, run to the barn and bring rope." Dorothea ordered. Fast as you can. The girl took off running. Dorothea lay down beside Coleman, looking over the edge. Thomas, can you hear me? The boy's tear-streaked face turned toward her, his eyes wide with terror. I'm going to help your papa pull you up, but I need you to be very brave. Can you do that? Can you give me your other hand? Thomas shook his head frantically, too scared to let go of the ledge. I know you're frightened, Dorothea said, keeping her voice calm even as her heart raced. I'm frightened too, but your papa's got you, and I've got you, and we're not going to let you fall. I promise you that, Thomas. On my life, I promise. Now give me your hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Thomas released the ledge and reached up with his free hand. Dorothea grabbed it, feeling the boy's small fingers lock around hers with desperate strength. Together, she and Coleman pulled, their combined strength just barely enough to lift the child up and over the crumbling edge. The moment Thomas was safe, Coleman crushed him against his chest, his whole body shaking with reaction. Dorothea sat back on her heels, her heart still pounding, watching father and son hold each other. Nibi came running back with the rope, saw her brother was safe, and threw herself into the embrace. And then, in a voice hoarse from disuse and tears, Thomas spoke his first words in over a year. I'm sorry, Papa. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to see where Mama used to pick flowers. I wanted to feel close to her. Coleman's face crumpled. He pressed his forehead to his son's and wept, great shuddering sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. It's all right, son. You're safe. That's all that matters. You're safe. Dorothea started to stand, to give them privacy, but Nibi grabbed her hand and pulled her back down. No, you're part of this too. You saved him. You're family now. And somehow, kneeling there in the dirt at the edge of that ravine, covered in dust and fear and relief, Dorothea felt something shift inside her chest. These broken people had let her in, had trusted her with their most precious things. And she realized with sudden clarity that somewhere in the past 8 days, she'd stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement. This was home. 3 weeks after Thomas spoke his first words, a stranger rode into the Frost Ranch at sunset. Dorothea was in the garden pulling carrots for supper when she heard the horse approach, its hooves striking the hard ground with the confident rhythm of an animal that had traveled far. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and felt an immediate sense of unease settle over her like a cold fog. The rider was a woman, perhaps 50 years old, dressed in expensive traveling clothes that looked absurdly out of place against the raw prairie landscape. She sat her horse with rigid posture, surveying the ranch buildings with an expression that suggested she was cataloguing deficiencies. Behind her rode a younger man, maybe 30, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent his life indoors. Coleman emerged from the barn, his face going carefully neutral in a way that told Dorothea this visitor was not welcome. Nibi and Thomas, who'd been playing near the house, went suddenly still and quiet, both children moving instinctively closer to the porch where they could retreat if necessary. "Constance," Coleman said flatly, "I wasn't expecting you." The woman dismounted with practiced efficiency, handing her reins to the younger man without looking at him. "Clearly. Or perhaps you would have prepared yourself better for this conversation." Her voice was cultured Eastern, with the kind of precise diction that came from expensive education. Her eyes swept over Coleman with obvious disapproval, before landing on Dorothea. "And who might this be?" "Mrs. Dorothea Mercer," Coleman said, moving to stand between the visitor and Dorothea in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. "She's helping manage the household. Dorothea, this is Constance Whitmore, my late wife's sister. And that's her son, Arthur." Understanding crashed over Dorothea like cold water. This was family. The kind of family that came with claims and expectations and the power to upend everything. She saw Nibi's face go pale, saw Thomas shrink back against the porch railing. "How convenient," Constance said, her gaze lingering on Dorothea's scarred face, with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for livestock. "Tell me, Mrs. Mercer, what exactly are your qualifications for managing a household with 2 half-breed children who require considerable civilizing?" The casual cruelty of the words hit Dorothea like a physical blow. She felt her face flush with anger, but before she could respond, Coleman stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll watch your tongue when speaking about my children, Constance. And if you've come all this way just to insult my family, you can turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Constance's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Your family. How interesting that you still call them that, given what I've learned about your circumstances." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather portfolio. "I've been corresponding with various officials throughout the territory, Coleman, making inquiries about the welfare of my sister's children. What I've discovered is rather disturbing." She opened the portfolio and began reading with the deliberate cadence of someone delivering a prepared speech. "According to territorial records, you've been operating this ranch at a loss for the past 2 years. You're 3 months behind on your land payments. The nearest schoolhouse is 40 miles away, meaning these children are receiving no formal education. And until very recently, you were caring for them alone, with no female presence to provide proper moral guidance and domestic instruction." "I'm providing for my children just fine," Coleman said through gritted teeth. "We have food, shelter, and love. That's more than a lot of families can say. Just eat." "Love," Constance repeated with withering scorn. "How very primitive of you. Tell me, Coleman, do you truly believe that love is sufficient preparation for these children to function in civilized society? Do you think love will erase the savage blood that runs through their veins? Do you think love will make them acceptable to decent people?" "That's enough," Dorothea heard herself say, her voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. She stepped around Coleman, moving to stand directly in front of Constance. "You come here uninvited, insult these children who've done nothing to deserve your contempt, and have the audacity to speak about civilization. Let me tell you something about civilization, Mrs. Whitmore. Civilized people don't measure a person's worth by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Civilized people don't use their education and status as weapons to hurt those with less power. And civilized people certainly don't show up at someone's home and insult their dead sister's children." For the first time, Constance's mask of superiority cracked slightly. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Dorothea more carefully. "You have opinions above your station, Mrs. Mercer, though I suppose that's to be expected from someone who appears to have suffered significant hardship. Tell me, how did you come to be employed here? What arrangement exists between you and my brother-in-law?" The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. Dorothea felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I came west seeking honest work. Mr. Frost needed help managing his household. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement, is it?" Constance turned her attention back to Coleman. "Because from where I'm standing, it appears you've brought an unmarried woman of questionable background to live under your roof with 2 impressionable children. That's hardly the kind of moral environment suitable for raising my sister's offspring." "Your sister's children are my children," Coleman growled. "And you have no claim on them, no right to question how I raise them." "Actually, I do." Constance pulled another document from her portfolio. "I've petitioned the territorial court for guardianship. Given your financial instability, lack of proper educational facilities, and questionable household arrangements, I believe a judge will find that these children would be better served in my care. I have a proper home in Boston, access to excellent schools, and the resources to provide them with opportunities they'll never have here in this wilderness." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Dorothea saw Coleman's face go white, saw his hands clench into fists. Nebe had moved to stand beside Thomas, both children holding each other with the desperate grip of those who'd learned that everything could be taken away without warning. "You can't do this," Coleman said, his voice rough with barely controlled rage. "You haven't seen these children in 3 years. You didn't come to your sister's funeral. You've never once inquired about their welfare until now. What changed, Constance said coldly, is that I've recently been widowed. My late husband left me a considerable estate, but no children of my own. These children represent my sister's legacy, and I intend to ensure they're raised properly. In a real home, with proper schooling, learning to be useful members of society rather than frontier savages who can barely read. They can read, Dorothea interjected sharply. Nibi reads at a level far beyond her years. Thomas is just beginning, but he's making excellent progress. I've been teaching them every evening after supper. Mathematics, history, literature, everything a proper education requires. Constance raised an eyebrow. You're a school teacher, then. I'm an educated woman who believes children deserve to learn, regardless of their circumstances. How admirable, Constance said with poisonous sweetness. And yet, without official certification or a proper schoolhouse, your efforts amount to little more than amateur tutoring. A judge will see it for what it is, an inadequate substitute for real education. She turned to Arthur, who'd been standing silently throughout the exchange. We'll be staying at Fort Ridgeway until the hearing. I expect it will be scheduled within the month. You're not taking my children, Coleman said, his voice deadly quiet. I don't care what papers you've filed or what judges you think you can buy. These are my children, and they're staying with me. Constance mounted her horse with the same practiced efficiency she'd shown dismounting. We'll see what the court has to say about that, Coleman. I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment. You've had 3 years to prove you could provide adequately for these children, and by all accounts, you've failed. It's time someone with actual resources took responsibility. She gathered her reins, then paused to look at Nibi and Thomas with an expression that might have been pity or contempt or some combination of both. Children, I want you to know that I'm doing this for your own good. One day, when you're older and educated and accepted by decent society, you'll understand that I saved you from a life of ignorance and poverty. She rode away without waiting for a response, Arthur trailing behind her like an obedient shadow. The sound of their horses' hooves faded into the distance, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Coleman stood frozen, staring at the horizon where Constance had disappeared, his face a mask of barely controlled devastation. Nibi was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, while Thomas held her hand with white-knuckled intensity. And Dorothea felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, something that made her want to chase after that cruel woman and physically prevent her from ever coming near these children again. "Papa," Nibi whispered, her voice breaking. "She can't take us away, can she? We don't want to go to Boston. We want to stay here with you." Coleman seemed to shake himself from his paralysis. He knelt down and pulled both children into his arms, holding them with desperate strength. "I won't let her take you. I swear on your mother's memory I will fight this with everything I have." But Dorothea could see the fear in his eyes, the terrible knowledge that sometimes love and determination weren't enough against the machinery of law and social prejudice. She'd seen it before, had lived through it herself when her own family had slowly edged her out of their lives after the fire. Society had rules about who belonged and who didn't, and those rules were enforced with ruthless efficiency. That night, after the children were finally asleep, their faces still tear-stained and their hands still clutching each other even in dreams, Dorothea found Coleman sitting on the porch in the darkness. He held a bottle of whiskey but hadn't opened it, just turning it over and over in his hands like a talisman against despair. "She's right about the finances," he said, without looking up. "I am behind on the land payments. The past 2 years have been hard. Drought, cattle disease, and me barely functional after losing my wife. I've been holding on by my fingernails, telling myself that as long as I kept the children fed and safe, nothing else mattered. But it does matter. The court won't care that I love them. They'll only care about what I can provide." Dorothea sat down beside him, close but not touching. "What about the schooling? Can we establish something more formal? Show that you're addressing that concern. With what money? I can barely afford to keep this ranch running. I certainly can't hire a certified teacher or build a proper schoolhouse. Then we document what we're already doing, Dorothea said, her mind racing. I may not be certified, but I'm educated. I attended normal school in Ohio before I married. I never completed my certification because my father got sick and I had to come home. But I can prove I have the knowledge. We create a curriculum, keep detailed records of the children's progress, show that they're receiving an education equivalent to what they'd get in any rural schoolhouse. Coleman finally looked at her, something like hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. You do that. Put yourself through all that work, knowing that if Constance wins, you'll be out of a position anyway. I'm not doing it for the position, Dorothea said firmly. I'm doing it for Nebe and Thomas. They deserve to stay with their father in the home where they can still feel their mother's presence. They deserve to grow up knowing both sides of their heritage instead of being forced to deny half of who they are to satisfy some narrow-minded society woman's idea of civilization. Something shifted in Coleman's expression as he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch. Why do you care so much? You've only known us a few weeks. You could walk away from this whole mess, find another situation somewhere else. Dorothea was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. After my husband died, and I was left with these scars, people I'd known my whole life started treating me like I'd become something less than human. They pitied me, but they didn't want me around. I was a reminder that bad things could happen to anyone, that the life they took for granted could be destroyed in an instant. So they pushed me to the margins, made me invisible, told themselves they were being kind by giving me charity work, while making it clear I'd never be welcome in their parlors again. She turned to face him directly. I see Constance doing the same thing to your children that my community did to me. She looks at them and sees something that needs to be fixed, civilized, made acceptable. She doesn't see the fierce intelligence in Nebe's eyes or the sensitive soul hiding behind Thomas's silence. She sees problems to be solved, embarrassments to be corrected. And I'll be damned if I stand by and let her strip away everything that makes those children remarkable, just so they can fit into her narrow definition of acceptable. Coleman's throat worked as he swallowed hard. I'm not good with words, Mrs. Mercer, never have been. But what you're doing for us, what you've already done, it means more than I can say. Those children, they light up when you're around. They're happier than they've been since their mother died. And me, well, I'm starting to remember what it feels like to have hope. But then we fight, Dorothea said simply. We document everything. We show the court that these children are thriving. And we make it impossible for any judge to justify tearing them away from their home. Over the next 2 weeks, Dorothea threw herself into creating an unassailable case for the children's education. She established a formal daily schedule with specific hours dedicated to different subjects. She tested Nebe and Thomas to establish their baseline knowledge, then created detailed lesson plans showing progressive development. She even wrote to her former instructor at the normal school in Ohio, requesting documentation of her own educational background. But it wasn't enough, and they both knew it. Constance had money and social standing and the prejudices of an entire society backing her claim. She could hire expensive lawyers who knew how to manipulate the law. She could present herself as a respectable widow, offering to rescue 2 unfortunate mixed-race children from poverty and isolation. The hearing was set for 3 weeks from Constance's visit. Fort Ridgway didn't have a proper courthouse, so Territorial Judge Marcus Wendell would be traveling from the county seat to hear the case in the trading post's main room. Word spread quickly through the scattered community, and Dorothea could feel the weight of judgment settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Some of the neighboring ranchers expressed quiet support for Coleman, but others made it clear they thought Constance was right. Those children need proper civilizing, she overheard one woman say at the trading post. It's not natural raising them out here like wild Indians. Mrs. Whitmore's doing a Christian duty, taking them in. The night before the hearing, Dorothea couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the prairie wind howl around the house, thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. She'd prepared everything she could prepare, documented everything she could document, but she knew it might not be enough. A soft knock on her door made her sit up. "Mrs. Mercer?" Neeby's voice small and frightened. "Can I come in?" Dorothea opened the door to find both children standing in the hallway, wrapped in blankets and holding hands. "We can't sleep," Neeby whispered. "Thomas keeps having bad dreams about being taken away. And I keep thinking about Boston and how we'd be trapped there forever, pretending to be something we're not." "Come here," Dorothea said, opening her arms. Both children rushed to her, and she held them close, feeling their small bodies shake with suppressed fear. "Listen to me. Your father loves you more than anything in this world. I've never seen a man fight harder for his children. And tomorrow we're going to walk into that hearing and show Judge Wendell exactly why you belong here, with him, in this home." "But what if he doesn't listen?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "What if the judge thinks we're better off with Aunt Constance because she has more money?" "Then we'll appeal," Dorothea said firmly. "And if that doesn't work, we'll find another way. But I want you both to understand something. No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what any judge or lawyer or society woman says, you are valuable exactly as you are. Your mother's heritage is not something to be ashamed of. It's a gift, and anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong." She felt Neeby nod against her shoulder. "Mama used to say that we were bridge people, that we belonged to both worlds, and that made us twice as strong instead of half as good." "Your mama was right," Dorothea said. "And tomorrow we're going to make sure that judge understands that." But as she held these frightened children and listened to the wind howl its warnings against the walls, Dorothea couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would require more than documentation and testimony. It would require a miracle. Judge Marcus Wendell arrived at Fort Ridgeway on a grey morning that threatened rain, riding in a covered wagon that also served as his travelling chambers. He was a large man in his 60s, with a face carved by weather and hard decisions, known throughout the territory for being fair but inflexible once he'd made up his mind. Dorothea watched from the trading post window as he dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who'd spent too many hours on rough roads. The main room of Brennan's trading post had been hastily transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Chairs borrowed from various households lined both sides of a central aisle, and a table at the front served as the judge's bench. The smell of leather, tobacco, and nervous sweat hung thick in the air. By 9 o'clock, nearly 40 people had crowded into the space. Drawn by curiosity and the frontier's hunger for drama, Constance sat on the right side with Arthur and a sharp-faced lawyer named Horace Pemberton, who travelled from Denver specifically for this case. She wore black silk that probably cost more than Coleman earned in a year, her hair arranged in elaborate curls that spoke of hours spent with a lady's maid. She looked every inch the respectable widow, the kind of woman judges instinctively trusted. Coleman sat on the left with Dorothea and the children, all of them wearing their Sunday best, which still looked shabby compared to Constance's finery. Neeby's dress had been let down twice and still showed the hem marks. Thomas wore pants that were slightly too short, revealing the gap between trouser and boot. Coleman's suit was clean but dated, the jacket tight across shoulders that had broadened since he'd last worn it for his wife's funeral. Judge Wendell surveyed the crowded room with shrewd eyes before banging a wooden mallet against the table. "This is a custody hearing regarding the minor children Neeby and Thomas Frost, currently in the care of their father, Coleman Frost. Mrs. Constance Whitmore has petitioned for guardianship. This is not a criminal proceeding, but I expect everyone to conduct themselves with appropriate decorum." His gaze swept the audience, lingering on a group of ranchers who'd already been passing a flask. "Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Are we clear?" A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. "Mr. Pemberton, you may present Mrs. Whitmore's petition." The lawyer stood with theatrical precision, his every movement calculated for maximum effect. "Your Honor," This case concerns two innocent children being raised in conditions that can only be described as inadequate. Mrs. Whitmore, the children's maternal aunt and closest living relative besides their father, seeks to provide them with opportunities they cannot possibly receive in their current circumstances. He paused, letting the words settle. I will demonstrate that Mr. Frost, despite his undoubtedly sincere affection for these children, lacks the financial stability, educational resources, and social environment necessary to prepare them for productive lives in civilized society. Dorothea felt Coleman tense beside her. She placed her hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay calm, to let the process unfold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Pemberton spent the next hour systematically dismantling Coleman's life. He presented documentation of the overdue land payments, testimony from creditors about unpaid debts, and statements from neighboring ranchers describing the isolated nature of the Frost Ranch. He called witnesses who testified that the nearest schoolhouse was indeed 40 miles away, that Coleman had been operating without hired help until recently, that the children had been seen doing manual labor inappropriate for their ages. These children are being raised more like frontier laborers than future citizens, Pemberton declared with rehearsed outrage. They spend their days tending animals and working fields when they should be learning mathematics, literature, and proper social deportment. Mr. Frost may love his children, but love alone cannot compensate for the complete absence of civilized advantages. Then Pemberton called his star witness. Constance took the stand with practiced dignity, her hands folded demurely in her lap, her voice trembling with what might have been genuine emotion or masterful performance. I loved my sister dearly, she began, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. When she chose to marry Mr. Frost and move to this wilderness, I begged her to reconsider. I told her that the frontier was no place to raise a family, especially children of mixed heritage who would face prejudice and limited opportunities. But Elizabeth was headstrong, and she believed that love would be enough. Constance's voice broke slightly. She died believing that giving birth to a child who didn't survive, in a place where proper medical care was days away, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of rain beginning to patter against the roof. Dorothea watched the judge's face, trying to read his reaction, but Wendell's expression remained professionally neutral. After my sister's death, I gave Mr. Frost space to grieve and adjust, Constance continued. I believed he would eventually recognize that he couldn't manage alone, that he would reach out for help. But years passed with no word. When I finally made inquiries, I discovered that these children, my sister's legacy, were growing up in near isolation, with minimal education and no female influence to guide them. That's when I knew I had to act. She looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, I'm not seeking to punish Mr. Frost or question his love for his children. I'm simply trying to honor my sister's memory by ensuring her children have the opportunities she would have wanted them to have. In my home in Boston, they would attend excellent schools, associate with respectable families, and learn to navigate society successfully despite the challenges of their mixed heritage. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Wendell said, his voice carefully neutral. You mentioned the children's mixed heritage several times. Does that factor into your desire for guardianship? Constance's expression became earnest, almost pleading. Your Honor, I speak frankly because I believe honesty serves everyone best. These children will face prejudice throughout their lives because of their native blood. That's an unfortunate reality. But with proper education, refined manners, and association with respectable society, they can overcome much of that prejudice. Here, isolated on a failing ranch, they're learning to be neither fully white nor fully native. They're becoming outcasts in both worlds. I want to give them the tools to succeed in the world as it is, not as we wish it might be. It was a masterful performance. Constance had wrapped her prejudice in concern, her desire for control in claims of altruism. And Dorothea could see it working. Several people in the audience were nodding along, their expressions suggesting they found Constance's arguments reasonable. When Pemberton finished, Judge Wendell turned to Coleman. "Mr. Frost, you may present your defense." Coleman stood slowly. He had no lawyer, no prepared speech, just his own words and the truth of his life. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "Your Honor, everything Mr. Pemberton said about my finances is true. I'm behind on payments. These have been hard years. But I'm not destitute. I have cattle, good land, and the skills to make this ranch profitable again. I've already started negotiations with the bank for extended terms, and I have commitments from 2 other ranchers to purchase cattle this spring." He pulled papers from his pocket, slightly crumpled but official. "As for education, Mrs. Mercer has been providing daily instruction to both children. Nibi can read and write at a level that would put her ahead of most children her age in any schoolhouse. Thomas is progressing rapidly in his basics. Mrs. Mercer herself attended normal school and has the knowledge to provide excellent education." Judge Wendell glanced at Dorothea. "Mrs. Mercer, are you certified to teach?" Dorothea stood. "No, Your Honor. I completed 2 years at Ohio Normal School, but had to leave before certification due to family illness. However, I have documentation of my coursework and letters from my instructors attesting to my capabilities. I've also created detailed curricula and progress reports for both children, which I can provide for your review." "Provide them," Wendell said, extending his hand. Dorothea passed forward the folder she'd spent weeks preparing, watching anxiously as the judge leafed through page after page of lesson plans, test results, and documented progress. After several minutes of silent reading, Wendell looked up. "This is impressive work, Mrs. Mercer. These children are clearly receiving substantial education." He turned back to Coleman. "However, Mr. Frost, the question remains whether this arrangement is stable and appropriate. What exactly is Mrs. Mercer's position in your household?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Dorothea saw Constance lean forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. This was the trap they'd been waiting to spring. Coleman's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Mercer is my housekeeper and the children's teacher. She has her own room, and our arrangement is entirely proper and professional." "So you have an unmarried woman living under your roof," Pemberton interjected smoothly. "Sharing meals with your family, putting your children to bed, performing all the intimate duties of a wife without the legal and moral protection of marriage. And you see nothing inappropriate about this arrangement." "There's nothing inappropriate about it," Coleman said, his voice rising slightly. "Mrs. Mercer has been nothing but respectable and professional." "Perhaps," Pemberton said with false sympathy. "But appearances matter, Mr. Frost, especially when raising children who will already face societal challenges. What message does it send to have an unmarried woman in such a position? What will neighbors think? What will the children learn about proper social conventions?" Dorothea felt sick. They were using her presence, her attempt to help, as ammunition against Coleman. Every good thing she'd done for this family was being twisted into evidence of impropriety. "Your Honor," Coleman said desperately, "Mrs. Mercer has been a godsend to this family. My children were drowning in grief, and she helped them find their way back to life. She's kind, educated, and completely devoted to their welfare. If having her in my home is seen as improper, then I'll marry her. Right now, today, if that's what it takes to keep my children—" The words fell into stunned silence. Dorothea felt her heart stop, then start again with painful intensity. She stared at Coleman, trying to process what he'd just said. A proposal born of desperation, offered in front of 40 witnesses and a territorial judge. Constance's lawyer pounced immediately. "How convenient, Mr. Frost. When faced with questions about propriety, you suddenly decide to marry the woman who's been living under your roof for weeks. This sounds less like genuine affection and more like a calculated attempt to appear respectable for this hearing." "It's not like that," Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Because it was exactly like that. A marriage of convenience offered in panic, with no consideration for what Dorothea might want. Judge Wendell held up his hand for silence. Mr. Frost, I appreciate your willingness to address the propriety concerns, but I'm not interested in shotgun marriages performed to sway legal proceedings. He turned to Dorothea. Mrs. Mercer, I'd like to hear from you. You've been caring for these children for several weeks now. What is your assessment of their well-being and their father's capabilities? Dorothea stood on shaking legs, acutely aware that every eye in the room was on her, that her words might determine whether this family stayed together or was torn apart. She looked at Nebe and Thomas, both children staring at her with desperate hope, then at Coleman, whose face showed equal parts fear and exhaustion. Your Honor, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I came west as a widow with no prospects and a face that most people find difficult to look at. I expected to spend the rest of my life as invisible labor, useful but unwanted. When I met the Frost family, they didn't see my scars. They saw someone who might understand what it means to be judged for circumstances beyond your control. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Mrs. Whitmore speaks about preparing these children for society, about giving them advantages. But what she's really offering is a chance for them to deny half of who they are, to suppress their mother's heritage, to pretend they're something they're not, all in service of fitting into a society that will never fully accept them anyway. She saw Constance's face flush with anger, but pressed on. Mr. Frost is raising his children to be proud of all their heritage, both native and white. Nebe knows her mother's language, understands the traditions and stories of her people. Thomas is learning the same. Yes, they work hard, but frontier children all work hard. That's not exploitation, it's survival. And through that work, they're learning responsibility, resilience, and self-sufficiency. Those are valuable lessons, but are they enough? Judge Wendell asked quietly. Can hard work and pride in heritage compensate for limited social opportunities and precarious finances? I don't know, Dorothea admitted honestly. But I know this. In the weeks I've been at the Frost Ranch, I've watched Nebe blossom from a quiet, wary child into a confident young girl who asks questions and dreams about the future. I've watched Thomas learn to speak again, to trust again, to believe that the world might still hold good things. And I've watched Mr. Frost pour every ounce of strength he has into providing for his children while honoring their mother's memory. That's not failure. That's love in its purest form. She turned to face Constance directly. Mrs. Whitmore, you speak about your sister's memory, about honoring her legacy. But Elizabeth Frost chose this life. She chose to marry a man she loved, to build a home in the wilderness, to raise her children connected to both their heritages. Taking those children to Boston, teaching them to be ashamed of half their blood, forcing them to fit a mold that will never quite accommodate them. That's not honoring her memory. That's erasing it. The rain had intensified, drumming against the roof like urgent fingers. Judge Wendell sat back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. I'd like to hear from the children themselves. Nebe, Thomas, would you come forward? The children walked to the front with Nebe holding her brother's hand. They looked so small standing before the judge's makeshift bench, two frightened children whose entire world hung in the balance. Wendell's voice gentled considerably. Nebe, you're old enough to understand what's happening here. Your aunt wants to take you to Boston where you'd have schools and opportunities. Your father wants you to stay here on the ranch. What do you want? Nebe stood straighter, her voice clear, despite the tears streaming down her face. I want to stay home, sir. I want to stay with Papa and Mrs. Mercer and my brother. I want to visit Mama's grave and remember the songs she taught me and grow up in the house she made for us. And Constance might have big houses and fancy schools, but she doesn't have what matters. She doesn't have love that sees me for who I really am, instead of who she thinks I should be. Judge Wendell nodded slowly, then looked at Thomas. And you, son? What do you want? Thomas's voice was barely audible. I want my papa. Those 4 words, spoken with absolute conviction by a child who'd spent a year silent with grief, seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Dorothea saw several people in the audience wipe their eyes. Judge Wendell leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The room held its collective breath, waiting for a decision that would reshape lives. Finally he spoke. This is not an easy case. Both parties present legitimate concerns and reasonable arguments. Mrs. Whitmore is correct that these children face challenges. Due to their isolated circumstances and mixed heritage, Mr. Frost is correct that love and stability have value that cannot be measured in financial terms alone. He paused, his eyes moving between the two sides. However, I am not in the business of separating families based on economic status alone, nor am I convinced that being raised with pride in one's full heritage constitutes neglect. The children are clearly loved, adequately fed and clothed, and receiving education that meets or exceeds basic standards. Dorothea felt hope surge in her chest, but Wendell wasn't finished. That said, the financial instability cannot be ignored, nor can the questions about household propriety. Therefore, I'm issuing a conditional custody order. The children will remain with their father for 6 months. During that time, Mr. Frost must bring his land payments current and demonstrate financial stability. Additionally, the household arrangement must be formalized. Either Mrs. Mercer's position must be clearly established through proper employment contracts, or Mr. Frost must make other arrangements for the children's care and education. If at the end of 6 months these conditions are not met, I will revisit Mrs. Whitmore's petition for guardianship. It was a partial victory at best, a stay of execution rather than absolution, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The children would stay home 6 months. That's all the time they had to transform a struggling ranch into a solvent operation and resolve the question of propriety that hung over the household like a sword suspended by thread. The ride back from Fort Ridgway was silent except for the steady rhythm of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels. Rain had turned the trail to mud, making progress slow and treacherous. Coleman hadn't spoken since they'd left the trading post. His jaw set in that particular way Dorothea had learned meant he was working through problems in his head, calculating odds and weighing impossible choices. The children sat between them, exhausted from the emotional ordeal, Neeby's head resting against Dorothea's shoulder while Thomas leaned into his father's side. It wasn't until they were home, the children finally asleep after tears and reassurances, that Coleman found Dorothea in the kitchen. She was making coffee with shaking hands, the events of the day finally catching up to her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I shouldn't have said what I said in there," he began, his voice rough. "About marrying you. That was wrong of me, putting you on the spot like that, using you as a convenient solution to my problems. You deserve better than a proposal made out of desperation in front of half the territory." Dorothea poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table toward him. "Sit down, Coleman. We need to talk about this plainly." He sat, wrapping his large hands around the cup as if drawing warmth from it. In the lamplight, she could see new lines of worry etched into his weathered face, the silver at his temples seeming more pronounced than it had that morning. "The judge gave us 6 months to make this work," Dorothea said. "That means we need to address both problems simultaneously, the financial situation and the propriety issue. They're connected in ways that make them harder to solve separately." "I know." Coleman stared into his coffee. "I've been running numbers in my head all the way home. Even if I sell every head of cattle I can spare, take on debt I can't comfortably service, and work myself to death for the next 6 months, I might be able to catch up on the land payments, but that leaves nothing for hiring proper help. Nothing for establishing you as a legitimate employee with formal contracts and wages. And even if you could afford to pay me properly, the question of propriety remains," Dorothea finished. "An unmarried woman living in a widower's home, no matter how professionally arranged, will always raise eyebrows in certain circles." Constance made sure everyone in that courtroom understood the implications. They sat in heavy silence, both of them seeing the trap clearly now. Judge Wendell had given them conditions that were nearly impossible to meet separately and potentially contradictory when considered together. spend money to establish proper employment, but also solve financial problems that left no money for such establishments. Maintain propriety, but do so in a way that satisfied social conventions designed to make life difficult for people in precisely their circumstances. "There is one solution," Coleman said finally. "The one I stupidly blurted out in the hearing. A real marriage, properly done. It would solve the propriety issue immediately, and it would give you legal standing as the children's stepmother. That would make it much harder for Constance to argue that they lack proper female guidance." Dorothea's heart was beating too fast. She'd been thinking the same thing during the long ride home, turning the idea over in her mind like a stone she was trying to see from all angles. "A marriage of convenience," she said carefully. "A business arrangement, yes." Coleman looked up at her, his grey eyes holding something she couldn't quite identify. "I won't pretend it's romantic or fair to you. I'm a widower with 2 children, a failing ranch, and more problems than solutions. But I can promise you respect, a home for as long as you want one, and legal protection. You'd have a say in decisions about the children and the ranch. You'd be a partner, not just hired help. And what about love?" The question slipped out before Dorothea could stop it. Coleman was quiet for a long moment. "I loved my wife. Loved her more than I thought it was possible to love another person. When she died, something in me died with her. I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of love again. And I won't lie to you and say I am just to make this arrangement more palatable." He met her eyes steadily. "But I respect you, Dorothea. I admire your strength and your fierce protection of my children. And I think, given time, we could build something good together. Maybe not the passionate romance young people dream about, but something solid. Something that lasts." It was the most honest proposal Dorothea had ever heard. Brutal in its refusal to offer false hope, but also strangely respectful in its acknowledgement of what was and wasn't possible between them. She thought about her options, laying them out with the same ruthless clarity Coleman had just demonstrated. She could refuse and find another position. Leave this family she'd grown to love and watch from a distance as they either survived or were torn apart. She could accept and enter into a marriage that might never include love, that would tie her legally to a man and a life with no guarantee of happiness. Or she could propose some middle path that satisfied neither the law nor their hearts. "I want to marry you," Dorothea said, and watched surprise flicker across Coleman's face. "Not because I'm desperate or because I have no other options, but because in the past few weeks this has become my home. These children have become my children in every way that matters, except law. And you've become someone I trust, someone I respect. You're right that it's not passionate romance. But you know what I've learned? Passionate romance burns bright and fast, and when it's gone, you're left in the dark wondering what happened. What you're offering, what we could build together, that's steadier. That's the kind of light you can navigate by." Something shifted in Coleman's expression, the careful guard he maintained slipping just enough to show the man beneath. "You're sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. You'd be tied to this struggling ranch and this complicated family, I'm sure." And she was. The certainty settled over her like a warm cloak, chasing away the last of her doubts. "When? Soon. Within the week if we can arrange it. The sooner we're properly married, the sooner that particular weapon gets taken out of Constance's hands." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the area. It was nothing like Dorothea's first wedding, which had been a proper church affair, with family and friends, and a white dress she'd sewn herself. This was a simple ceremony in the Frost Ranch parlor with only the children as witnesses. Vows exchanged in quiet voices that nevertheless carried the weight of genuine commitment. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Coleman kissed her cheek with careful respect, and Dorothea felt the strangest sensation of both loss and gain. She'd gained a family, legal protection, a place in the world. But she'd also given up the last possibility of that passionate romance she'd once dreamed about as a girl. This was adult love, practical love, the kind built on mutual need and respect rather than desire and dreams. Nebe and Thomas seemed to sense the solemnity of the occasion. After the preacher left with his fee, the four of them sat together at the kitchen table, eating the simple cake Dorothea had baked that morning. It felt less like a wedding celebration and more like a family meeting where everyone understood the stakes, but hoped for the best anyway. "Does this mean we should call you Mama now?" Thomas asked, his small voice uncertain. Dorothea looked at Coleman, who nodded slightly. "You can call me whatever feels right to you," she said gently. "I'm not trying to replace your mother. No one could do that. But I am here, and I'm not leaving, and I'll love you as fiercely as any mother could." "Mama Dorothea," Nebe said thoughtfully. "That's what we'll call you. Because you're our new mama, but Mama Elizabeth will always be our first mama. That way we honor both of you." And just like that, the arrangement became real. Dorothea Mercer was now Dorothea Frost, wife and stepmother, legally bound to a man she barely knew, and children she'd love for the rest of her life. But marriage solved only one of their problems. The financial crisis loomed like a storm on the horizon, dark and threatening and inevitable. Coleman threw himself into work with desperate intensity, rising before dawn and working until well past dark. He sold cattle at prices that made him wince, negotiated with creditors who sensed his vulnerability and pressed their advantage, and took on additional work hauling freight for neighboring ranches. Dorothea managed the household with military efficiency, stretching every dollar until it screamed. She planted an expanded garden, preserved everything she could, and found ways to make meals from ingredients that seemed too meager to feed a family. She took in mending from other ranchers' wives, her scarred hands flying through repairs by lamplight while the children slept. But it wasn't enough. By the third month, they were still short of what they needed. The bank had agreed to extend the deadline on the land payment, but only by 30 days, and only if Coleman could demonstrate good faith by paying at least half of what he owed. They were $1,000 short, a sum that might as well have been $1 million for all the chance they had of raising it. Dorothea found Coleman in the barn one night, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands, the picture of defeat. She sat beside him without speaking, just offering her presence. After a long moment he spoke. "I'm going to lose it all. The ranch, the children, everything. I've worked myself to exhaustion, sold everything that wasn't nailed down, and it's still not enough. In 3 months, Judge Wendell will review our situation, see that we've failed to meet the financial requirements, and give Constance exactly what she wants." "We haven't failed yet," Dorothea said firmly. "We have 3 months left. That's enough time to try things we haven't tried yet." "Like what?" "I've exhausted every option. There's no more cattle to sell, no more work to take on, no more corners to cut." Dorothea had been thinking about this for weeks, turning an idea over in her mind, examining it from every angle. It was risky and would require swallowing considerable pride, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "We asked the community for help," she said. Coleman looked at her like she'd suggested they grow wings and fly to the moon. "Ask for charity? From people who already look at us sideways because of what my children are. From neighbors who've made it clear they think Constance has the right idea. Not charity, investment. We show them what we've built here, what this family represents. We give them a chance to be part of something that matters." She turned to face him directly. "Coleman, people in this territory face the same struggles we do. Isolation, prejudice, financial hardship, the constant fear of losing everything they've worked for. If we can survive this, if we can prove that a mixed family can thrive despite everything working against them, that gives other people hope. That's worth investing in. You're talking about making our private struggles public, about exposing the children to more judgment, more scrutiny. I'm talking about showing people that our struggles aren't shameful, that needing help doesn't make us weak. That community means supporting each other through hard times, not just celebrating together when things are easy." She grabbed his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that matched her own. "We've been so focused on proving we don't need help that we've isolated ourselves. But maybe that's exactly what Constance wants. For us to be alone, to fail alone, so she can swoop in and claim she was right all along. Coleman was quiet, clearly struggling with the idea of making himself vulnerable in such a public way. Finally, he squeezed her hand. What did you have in mind? Over the next week, they planned carefully. Dorothea drafted a letter explaining their situation with brutal honesty, describing the judge's conditions, their financial shortfall, and their determination to keep their family together. She wrote about the children's progress in education, about the home they'd built, about the values they were trying to instill. Then she made copies and posted them at every trading post, church, and gathering place within 50 miles. The response was not what they expected. Some people ignored the letter entirely. Others sent dismissive responses, suggesting that if Coleman couldn't manage his own affairs, perhaps Constance's intervention was for the best. But then something unexpected happened. A rancher named Samuel Blackwood, who'd lost his own daughter to fever the previous year, showed up with $50 and an offer to buy cattle at fair market price, rather than the desperate rates Coleman had been accepting. A widow named Martha Chen, who'd faced her own battles with prejudice after marrying a Chinese railroad worker, brought preserved food and offered to help with the garden. The preacher who'd married them returned with contributions collected from 3 different congregations. One by one, people began arriving. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. They came with money, food, labor, and something even more valuable. The message that the Frost family's struggle mattered, that their fight to stay together was worth supporting. Some came because they'd faced similar battles. Some came because they admired the family's determination. And some came because they'd read Dorothea's letter and recognized something of themselves in the desperate hope contained in those carefully chosen words. Thomas and Nibby watched with wide eyes as their isolated ranch became a hub of activity. Neighbors they barely knew showed up to help mend fences, repair outbuildings, and prepare for spring planting. Women who'd previously kept their distance brought supplies and stayed to teach Dorothea preservation techniques she'd never learned. Men who'd looked at Coleman with suspicion started treating him with respect earned through witnessing his tireless work. By the end of the 5th month, they'd raised $700. It wasn't the full $1,000 they needed, but combined with Coleman's own savings and the extended payment plan, it was enough. Barely enough, knife-edge enough, but enough. The night before, they were due to make the payment to the bank. Dorothea lay awake in the bed she now shared with Coleman, though they maintained careful distance even in sleep. She listened to his breathing in the darkness, thinking about how much had changed in 5 months. They were married but still essentially strangers in many ways, partners in survival but not yet partners in heart. "Are you awake?" Coleman's voice, quiet in the darkness. "Yes. I never thanked you properly. For the letter, for the idea to reach out to the community. I couldn't have done that myself. Too much pride, too much fear of judgment. But you did it anyway, and it saved us. We saved us," Dorothea corrected. "All of us together. That's what family does." She felt rather than saw Coleman turn toward her in the darkness. "Dorothea, I know this isn't the marriage you might have wanted. I know I can't give you everything you deserve. But I want you to know that these past months, watching you fight for this family, watching you refuse to give up no matter how impossible things seemed, you've become essential to me. Not just because of what you do, but because of who you are." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was more than she'd expected, more than he'd promised when he proposed. It was a beginning, fragile and tentative, but real. "Ask me again in another 5 months. Dorothea said softly. "Ask me how I feel about this marriage after we've made it through whatever comes next. Because something is coming. Constance isn't going to accept this quietly. She'll find another way to challenge us." "I know," Coleman said, "but we'll face it together. That's more than I had before you came." The next morning, they rode to Fort Ridgeway with the children and made the payment to the bank. The banker counted the money twice, clearly surprised they'd managed to raise it, then stamped their receipt with official finality. "One condition met. The financial crisis resolved, at least temporarily. But as they prepared to leave, they saw Constance Whitmore's carriage parked outside the trading post. And Dorothea knew with absolute certainty that their battle was far from over. Constance Whitmore stood on the steps of the trading post like a general surveying a battlefield she fully expected to win. When she saw the Frost family emerge from the bank, her expression shifted from surprise to calculation so quickly that Dorothea almost missed the transition. Arthur stood behind his mother as always, a pale shadow carrying her bags and maintaining respectful distance. "Coleman!" Constance called out, her voice carrying across the muddy street. "How fortuitous. I was just about to ride out to your ranch. It seems we have matters to discuss." Coleman's hand found Dorothea's, squeezing once before releasing. "We have nothing to discuss, Constance. We've met Judge Wendell's conditions. The land payments are current, and my household arrangements are now legally sanctioned through marriage. Your petition has no grounds." Something almost like amusement flickered across Constance's aristocratic features. "Oh, Coleman, did you really think making this woman your wife would solve all your problems? I've spent the past 5 months gathering evidence that even your surprisingly effective community support cannot refute." Dorothea felt ice settle in her stomach. Nebe pressed closer to her side, while Thomas gripped his father's hand with white-knuckled intensity. Around them, a small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the scent of confrontation. Constance pulled a thick folder from Arthur's arms. "I hired investigators, Coleman. What they discovered is quite illuminating. For instance, did you know that your new wife spent 6 months in a charity asylum after her husband's death? That she suffered what doctors termed a complete nervous collapse brought on by trauma and disfigurement?" The words hit Dorothea like physical blows. She felt Coleman's sharp intake of breath, felt the eyes of the crowd turn toward her with renewed interest. "That was 3 years ago," Dorothea managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I recovered. I moved forward with my life, and did you?" Constance's smile was sharp as a blade. "According to medical records, you were released against medical advice. The doctors believed you needed continued treatment for severe melancholia. They warned that you were at risk of relapse, particularly under conditions of stress." "You had no right to access those records," Coleman said, his voice dangerous. "Rights are complex things on the frontier," Constance replied smoothly, "especially when children's welfare is at stake. A judge will be very interested to know that the woman caring for my sister's children has a documented history of mental instability." "Mama Dorothea isn't crazy," Nebe said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult tension. "She's the sanest person I know. She helps us when we're sad. She teaches us things, and she never pretends everything is fine when it's not." "That's not crazy. That's honest. There's more." Arthur spoke for the first time. "We also investigated Mr. Frost's financial situation. Several contributions came from individuals with questionable backgrounds. A former prisoner, a woman known to have struggled with opium addiction. The Frost family has been accepting money from society's outcasts. Those people," Dorothea said, her voice growing stronger with anger, "are human beings who showed kindness when it mattered. They gave from their own poverty because they understood what it meant to struggle. That's not a liability, that's humanity. That's naivety," Constance countered. "You've surrounded these children with criminals and addicts. What kind of future are you preparing them for? Certainly not one where they can succeed in respectable society." She turned to address the growing crowd. "I ask you all to consider what's happening here. 2 children of mixed heritage, already facing challenges, are being raised in an environment that will only make their lives harder. Their stepmother has a history of mental instability. Their father associates with social outcasts. Is this what we want for Elizabeth's children?" Dorothea felt the crowd's sentiment shifting. Constance was good at this, at wrapping prejudice in concern. "You want to know about legacy?" A new voice, rough and unexpected. Samuel Blackwood pushed through the crowd. "My daughter died last year because I couldn't afford a doctor in time. Then I watched the Frost family face down impossible odds. Watch them reach out when pride would have kept them silent. That's the legacy I want, not your version where we all stay in our proper places and pretend the edges don't matter. Martha Chen stepped forward next. Mrs. Whitmore talks about respectable society like it's something worth aspiring to. But respectable society wouldn't let me shop in certain stores after my husband died. The Frosts treated me like a human being. They taught their children to do the same. If that's disreputable, then I'm proud to be disreputable with them. One by one, the people who'd helped the Frost family began speaking up. They told stories of the family's kindness, their determination, their refusal to compromise their values for social acceptance. Constance's face grew progressively tighter. This is all very touching, but sentiment doesn't change facts. Mrs. Frost has a documented mental health history that poses risks. These are demonstrable facts that any judge will consider. Then let's talk about facts. Dorothea stepped forward. Yes, I spent 6 months in an asylum after my husband died, and I lost half my face. Yes, I had what doctors called a nervous collapse. Do you know what that means, Mrs. Whitmore? It means I loved someone so much that losing him broke something inside me. It means I was human enough to grieve, to fall apart, to need help putting myself back together. And yes, I recovered, against medical advice, because I decided that I got to choose when I was ready to face the world again. I rebuilt my life from nothing. I came west alone with scars that made people turn away. And I'm still standing. She turned to face the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore wants you to believe that my mental health history makes me dangerous, unstable, unfit to care for children. But I want you to think about what actually happened here. I came to a home where 2 children were drowning in grief. In 5 months, I've helped Thomas learn to speak again, taught Nibi that her mixed heritage is a strength, and supported Coleman while he fought to save his ranch. If that's what instability looks like, then perhaps we need more of it. Judge Wendell's voice cut through the tension. Seems I arrived just in time. The judge pushed through the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore, I received word you were here stirring up trouble. Thought I'd better ride over and see what new complications you've invented. Constance straightened. Your Honor, I'm merely ensuring you have all relevant information. Information about Mrs. Frost's mental health history and the questionable associations this family has cultivated. Wendell held out his hand. Let me see those documents. He spent several minutes reading, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he looked up. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to explain something to you about frontier justice. Out here, we judge people by what they do, not by what they've survived. Mrs. Frost's medical history shows she experienced severe trauma and sought appropriate treatment. The fact that she recovered enough to build a new life demonstrates resilience, not instability. As for the Frost family's associations, I fail to see how accepting help from people who've made mistakes is evidence of poor judgment. He handed the documents back. I'm issuing my final ruling now. The Frost children will remain with their father. The financial conditions have been met, the household is legally proper, and these children are thriving. Your petition for guardianship is denied, Mrs. Whitmore, permanently. Constance's face went white, then red with fury. You can't do this. I have rights as their aunt. You have the right to visit, assuming the family permits it, Wendell said firmly. You have no right to upend their lives because you've decided, years after their mother's death, that you suddenly care. This family has fought for every inch of ground they've gained. That's more than you've proved with your investigations and accusations. As Wendell walked away and the crowd dispersed, Constance stood frozen. She looked at the Frost family one last time, and for just a moment, Dorothea saw something other than calculation. Elizabeth would have hated me for this, Constance said quietly. She left our world because of people like me. And I've become exactly what she ran from. Before anyone could respond, she turned and walked toward her carriage. They drove away in silence, leaving the Frost family standing in the muddy street, victorious but exhausted. That night, after the children were asleep, Coleman and Dorothea sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. I never thanked you properly for what you said today, Coleman said. About your time in the asylum, about choosing to fight rather than hide. That took courage. You've been fighting for your children since before I arrived, Dorothea replied. I just helped tip the odds. Coleman was quiet for a moment. When I married you, it was supposed to be practical. A solution to a legal problem. But somewhere along the way it became something else. You've become essential to me. Not just as a mother to my children, but as someone I can't imagine my life without. Are you saying, I'm saying I love you? The words came out rough. Not the way I loved Elizabeth, because that was a different life. But this is real. You're real. And somewhere between fighting for our family and learning to hope again, I fell in love with you. Dorothea felt tears sting her eyes. I love you too. I think I have for a while now, he kissed her then. Not the careful peck of their wedding day, but a real kiss, full of promise and possibility. 6 months later, Dorothea stood in the garden, watching Nibi teach Thomas how to identify medicinal herbs. Both children speaking in a mixture of English and Ojibwe as naturally as breathing. The ranch was thriving. Coleman had hired 2 ranch hands. The root cellar was full. And Dorothea was expecting a child of her own. She thought about that day at Fort Ridgeway, when she'd stood invisible among younger women, convinced no one would ever choose her. She thought about Nibi's small hand slipping into hers, about all the battles they'd fought to get to this moment. What are you thinking about? Coleman asked, wrapping his arms around her. I'm thinking about how I came west expecting nothing and found everything, Dorothea said. I'm thinking about how the family I was meant to have chose me first. We're the lucky ones. We found each other when we needed it most, and standing there in the golden afternoon light, watching their children laugh and learn, Dorothea knew he was right. They'd been broken people who'd found each other in the margins, who'd built something solid from scraps and determination. They'd faced down prejudice, fought legal battles, and survived attempts to tear them apart, and they'd won. Not because they were perfect, but because they refused to give up on each other. Because when a little Chippewa girl had tugged a sleeve and said, "She'll be our mama," everyone had been brave enough to believe it could be true. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.